Cath, and I live in the middle of England, and this is an English story. It happened about 40 years ago, and it's about a young man who lived and worked in a town. He'd only been there less than a year, and before that he lived with his parents in a beautiful little village that was surrounded on all sides by wonderful, wild moorland. And he'd always loved it there. He used to play on the moor with his friends when he was a child, and he got on well with his parents. It was really an idyllic place to live, but young men being what they are, he wanted to make his way in life. So now he worked in a bank in the town. But the first thing he did, once he'd started getting paid, was to save up his money so that he could buy a little old car so that he could visit his parents quite often. And now it was nearly Christmas. So he packed his suitcase with warm clothes and he put his suitcase in his car and off he went, driving towards home. He still thought of it as home. In fact, for the rest of his life, he always would. And as he began to drive, of course, at this time of year in England, after he'd left work, it was already dark. And his little old car, it chugged along as best it could for some miles. And then he saw, just in the faint moonlight, that moorland stretching away to one side of the road. And he thought, a few more miles, we'll just go round the edge of the moorland and then there'll be the road across the moor to the village. A few more miles and I'll be home with Mum and Dad. And it started to snow. Great heavy flakes of snow, and those poor old windscreen wipers could hardly keep up. And he came to a hill and the car began to cough. And the car began to hesitate and the car began to wheeze. And before long, the car had stopped and it would not start. Now, as luck would have it, there was a lay-by and he let the car roll back into the lay-by. And then he rummaged in his suitcase and he took off his jacket and he put on an extra shirt, he put on an extra jumper, he wriggled into extra trousers, he put his scarf back round his neck, he put his coat on, hat on his head, and he set off to walk across the moor. Because he'd known that moor all his life, of course he could find his way home. And the pale moonlight, it was just enough to light the path ahead. But then the wind blew and the snow came in flurries and it came down more and more heavily until he could barely see in front of him. And he could see the foolishness of being lost on the moor at night in the snow. And the wise thing to do was to turn round and follow his own footprints back to the road. At least inside the car, he'd have a bit of shelter. But when he turned to look, the snow had already filled in his footprints and he could not see which way he needed to go. The only thing to do was to press on and hope that his instincts would lead him home. And he walked for quite some time, and even though he was wearing all his extra clothes, the cold began to seep through and he was shivering, screwing his eyes up to try to see through the snow. It might have been his imagination, but there appeared to be a figure ahead of him. It looked like a person some way ahead. And he called out, "Anybody there?" No reply. But as he took a few steps further on, he heard a voice calling his name. And he went towards that voice. And again the voice called his name. And every now and then, through that thick snow, he could see a faint figure ahead of him, and he called out, "If you wait, if you hold on, we can walk together. Just wait." But the figure never did. It was always just ahead, not quite out of sight. And every now and then he heard his name called. And he went on like that for, truth be told, some miles in the cold, following this mysterious figure, until at last he saw ahead of him, just faintly through the snow, but he saw lights, and it was his village. And as he looked, there was one light that was swaying from side to side. And as he got closer, he recognized, even though he was bundled up with hat and coat and scarves and mufflers, it was his own father carrying a lantern. And he ran forward. He said, "Dad, I am so glad to see you." And his father said, "Yes, your mum." And in that moment, of course, that voice, it had been distorted by the wind and muffled by that thickly falling snow. But of course, that voice was his mother's. How could he not have recognized his own mother's voice? And he said, "Mum, she's not." And his father looked at him. And his father said, "What? Mum's not what? Earlier on, she fell asleep. She had a dream that she was calling you. So Muggins here, I get sent out in the snow with a flipping lantern to come and find you. When I left the house, she was making mulled wine. If we hurry up, we'll get home before the alcohol evaporates." And they did. And that's the story of driving home for Christmas. And my words to you to remember this Advent are: always get home before the alcohol evaporates. Thank you.